get started then. Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this special SPIN lunchtime event. I'm Dr. Elusive van Buren, an associate professor in the School of Sociology, Politics, and International Studies at the University of Bristol. But I'm also coordinator of SPIN, the Secrecy, Power, and Ignorance Research Network, based in the Southwest of the United Kingdom. So our event today is supported by the Southwest Doctoral Training Program, and it's part of a series of events over the next 18 months that center secrecy and ignorance as important subjects of study and worthy of greater attention, whether empirically, theoretically, or methodologically. So for example, in 2 weeks' time, we have a repeat of our popular magical encounter session with SPIN's Professor Brian Rappert. And then next year in February, and then following in April, we have 2 further sessions. One, we'll be pleased to welcome Emily Van Duyn from the University of Illinois, who will be talking about her new book, Democracy Lives in Darkness. And then following that by Hannah Jones in April, talking about violent ignorances. So do visit the SWDTP website or the SPIN website for further information. Today, though, I'm delighted to welcome our special guest, Adam Sisman. So Adam is an award-winning writer and editor, the author of several books and edited volumes, not only on le Carré, but on other key British historians and historical figures such as Hugh Trevor Roper and James Boswell. And Boswell's Presumption, the book on Boswell, was shortlisted for the Whitbread Prize and won the US National Book Critics Circle Award for Biography. Trained as a historian at the University of Sussex, Adam Sisman is here today to talk about John le Carré and what it means to research and write about elusive subjects, including spies. So welcome, Adam. I'm really delighted that you're with us today. But alongside me today is also is also Ariel Sobel, who's a doctoral researcher at Brunel University and a member of the Women's Intelligence Network, WIN, and is herself conducting her own research on le Carré and the intersection of espionage, actors, and actor training. Okay, so why le Carré? Why have we at SPIN decided to focus on this intriguing person and to invite Adam to speak with us today? Well, le Carré passed away last year, but his imprint, his impact still lingers. As you may or may not know, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy has just been re-released. It was a massive book, and it's now a massive film that still plays in the public imagination and the public conversation when it comes to Britain's role as an intelligence, as a state that centers intelligence, that works in the intelligence arena. Le Carré himself is a very important figure in this conversation. So he's best known for his interventions in his fictionalized worlds, but he himself had a very interesting life, beginning as a spy, working for both MI5 and MI6 at the height of the Cold War. So the connection to these spy worlds is an obvious interest to SPIN, but our interest goes further than that. We're also interested in, for what I understand to be the challenge for many biographers or for researchers or for investigators to get to the heart of the story, to try and understand different perspectives, different positions, the challenge of writing and telling the story, in this case, of le Carré's life and of any biographer attempting to do this type of work. So what does it mean negotiating these histories, as well as, in particular, le Carré's particular tendency to continue to produce ambiguity about his life and work? So through our chat today, we're going to center around le Carré's early life and career, his globally famous spy fiction and his contributions to interpretations of the world, the role of the biographer in crafting narratives about elusive subjects, about writing and researching more generally, and the intellectual methodological orientation we might need to have when we approach those who may consider themselves as associated with secrets, and to think more generally about what it means to craft narratives and do research around secrecy. So as we go along, do consider adding your comments and thoughts to the chat function. We'll be keeping an eye on that. This is structured as a sort of a fireside chat. So we're going to have a back and forth, a conversation. I'll be asking lots of questions and Ariel will be asking questions. So we will be able to try and fold some of your comments and questions into the chat as we go along, but we will, however, save some time at the end for a Q&A session. Do keep your microphones off if they aren't already, and please be aware that we are recording this session as it'll be posted afterwards on the Southwest Doctoral Training Program's website. Okay, so without any further ado, I'll therefore start with our conversation by asking Adam if he can kindly summarize for us John le Carré's life, and perhaps then explain what drew you to this project to start with.
Yes, well, le Carré was born in 1931. He was a product of a very unusual family. His father was a con man on a massive scale, and during le Carré's childhood, they lived most of the time like millionaires, but sometimes the Bentley was hidden in the woods, the staff all disappeared, the furniture got sold, and finally the Rozzers came and took his father away for 6 months or a year or whatever period it was. His father spent several terms in prison, but nevertheless bounced back. And at his peak, for example, he owned a share of no fewer than 4,000 properties. 4,000, that's quite a number, isn't it? So he, and he also liked to live the high life and mix with sports stars, with MPs, High Court judges, even the judges who had sent him down. So this was a very odd environment to be born into. And le Carré's mother couldn't stand the pace. And when le Carré was only 5 years old and his brother was 7, she disappeared in the middle of the night and never came back. So you had this kind of very odd childhood with the flamboyant, dominant father and the missing mother. In fact, le Carré, as a boy, we better deal with nomenclature. His real name was David Cornwall, so I'm going to call him David for most of the time, if that's all right. David would go up to any woman who came to the house and ask her shyly, "Are you my mother?" He didn't remember his mother. And he didn't see her again until he was 21 and sought her out. So it was a sad boyhood. And his father, when the war broke out, le Carré was obviously only a schoolboy, and he was rather ashamed that his father was what they then called a spiv, in operating on the black market. So instead, he invented a story that his father was really a secret agent being parachuted into occupied Europe on special missions for the intelligence services. So really the spying started at home. He also spied on his father, kind of going into his father's bedroom and going through the pockets of his suits to try and work out what on earth was going on. So he learnt early on some of the tradecraft of the spy. Later on, he ran away from school. He went to Switzerland, to Bern, where he did a variety of jobs, working in a cafe, worked in a circus for a while, even washed elephants. And he was picked up by the local MI6 station as an informant. And he provided low-grade information, particularly about left-wing student societies and so on. Then he went to Oxford to read modern languages. He had to leave halfway through his degree because his father went bankrupt again. And he spent a year teaching, and then he went back to university and graduated with a first-class degree. He spent a couple of years more teaching, but he was already in touch with the intelligence services again. Oh, I should have said, while he was at Oxford, he was spying on his fellow students and informing on them. That's one of the most troubling aspects, perhaps, of his life, and one of which he was himself ashamed, that he would befriend people in order to spy on them. And some of those whom he befriended were very shocked when they found out 30 or 40 years later that he had been informing MI5 on their activities.
Adam, what was the context for that spying on fellow students at the time?
The context for that is in the, we're now in the early 1950s. There's a lot of anxiety about spying. There have been a series of spy scandals, particularly connected with the development of the A-bomb and later on the hydrogen bomb. And British spies have been at the center of that. There was also the scandals about the British spies who themselves had defected, Burgess and Maclean, And there was an idea that after the war, it might be just like the 1930s all over again, that young men and women at university might be recruited by communists to spy for the other side. So that's the context, and the people he was spying on were the two I know about were both left wing, one an American and one an English. Yeah.
And was that motivation, was it ideologically driven? Was it financial? What made, does he ever?
You mean ideologically driven on his side?
Yes.
Well, that's a very interesting point, because really he wasn't very political, and if anything, he was moderately left. But he had this desire. He was patriotic, and he had this desire to do the right thing by his country, to make up for his recalcitrant father. His father, during the Second World War, spent less than a week in uniform. One of the ways in which he avoided military service was to stand as a parliamentary candidate, which he did no fewer than 3 times during the war. And parliamentary candidates were, at that stage, allowed to forego military service. But as I say, it troubled him, particularly later on when he became more political and more left. Anyway, in the late 1950s, he stopped teaching and went into MI5 as an intelligence officer. And it was while he was working at MI5 in central London and commuting in on a commuter train that he started writing his first novel. In 1960, he transferred to MI6 and was posted to Bonn, then the capital of West Germany, which was the free, in inverted commas, part of Germany. It was while he was serving in West Germany that the Berlin Wall started to go up. And the Berlin Wall became the dominant motif of his third and breakthrough novel, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. And that totally changed his life. It was a huge bestseller. If I tell you that it was the biggest selling novel in America in 1964, you've got some idea of it. It outsold everything, including the final James Bond book, which was published in the same year. And in fact, people often made the comparison at the time. They said, this is the real thing. James Bond is a fantasy. Read John le Carré. It was extraordinarily successful. It totally transformed his life. It made him immediately very rich, and it meant that he had to leave MI6 because his cover was blown. And from then on, his life was in some ways more conventional. It was the life of a best-selling author, and he reached perhaps the apogee of his success in the 1970s and 80s. When, for example, his book about the Israelis and the Palestinians, The Little Drummer Girl, was the best-selling book that Knopf, his publishers at the time, had ever published. He was regularly getting advances for his books of several $1 million and earning large amounts from films as well as books. At the last count, I think 9 of his books had been made into feature films. And quite a number of television series, including the recent series, The Night Manager, which many of you will be aware of. I went to the memorial service for David Cornwell a few weeks ago, and the entire cast of The Night Manager were there. The Tom Hiddleston and Hollander and Hugh Laurie and so on. So it's quite starry. But his life, in a way, became more conventional. He remained loosely in touch with the intelligence services, although many people within MI5 and MI6 strongly disapproved of him, and also within the CIA. He was also in touch with the German intelligence services, the BND. It's often said that you never really leave MI6. You're always, in a way, on the books. But I don't think he had any active involvement. A reporting involvement, yes, but not any active involvement. So that's a brief.
Can you say a bit more about the work that he did, or at least the accounts that he gave of the works that he did, and maybe how those, yeah.
Well, one of the things you said, which occurred to me when you were giving your introduction, your interesting introduction, was that he said that the intelligence services reveal the real character of a state. They're the best way to find out what that state is really like. How rotten it might be. Turn it over, and underneath you find all these bad things happening. And he has certainly felt that many bad things have been happening in modern Britain, and not least, for example, the arrival of dirty money in the city. But he, more generally, he felt that if you looked at the intelligence services, you got a sense of not just what was happening in the spy world, but what was really happening in the world as a whole. His book, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, became the sort of definitive Cold War book. I mean, it is still a cliche, who came in from the cold, used thousands and thousands of times in headlines and other monikers of one kind or another. But he also sort of became known. The writer Blake Morrison had a nice phrase for this. He described le Carré as the laureate of Britain's post-imperial sleepwalk, and much of what he describes is in his books is the sort of difficulty that British people, English people particularly perhaps, have had in coming to terms with Britain's diminished role in the post-war, and particularly in the post-Cold War period. You mentioned the re-release of Tinker Tailor, the film of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. I did that's accompanying that as a little film interview with me, and in fact with two other people too. But in my interview, I said that although the film is very much a period film, it's set, the color palette is all brown. It's 1970s through and through. It's really more relevant in 2021 than it was when it was first released 10 years before, because in post-Brexit Britain, when Britain is struggling to find a role, not quite sure where it belongs vis-a-vis Europe, the United States, etc. Well, that was the sort of thing that was worrying le Carré when he wrote that book, and the characters in it express those sorts of anxieties.
And I think your accounts of le Carré, you also talk about other ways in which he reflected the politics of the moment, not just in relation to Britain as a kind of a post-imperial state, but also its relationship to the US.
Oh, definitely, yes. I mean, there is a strong vein of resentment, or indeed anti-Americanism. I gave a whole lecture on this subject in Washington a while back on anti-Americanism in le Carré, and this originated from I'd been at a conference of historians in Princeton, and one of the historians, this is before my book was published, got up and said that he felt the definitive statement of British or English anti-Americanism is to be found in Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy by John le Carré. And I said, yes, that's true. I got up and said, but the person who says it is the bad guy. So it's a bit ambiguous in that sense. But there is, I think, it reflects really the generation that le Carré was in. They grew up in a world when there was still, you could still talk about the British Empire without embarrassment, and a lot of the map was still coloured pink. There's been a series of painful reckonings ever since, and in coming to terms with the fact that Britain is a second-class nation and very dependent on the United States. The special relationship is not a relationship of equals, a theme that comes up again and again in le Carré's work.
So then, do you so I'm quite interested personally in the ways in which fictional worlds inform what we could call sort of factual worlds, right? Like that there is the ways in which we imagine and build these worlds actually has an impact on the ways in which they play out. Would you say that the same holds for Le Carré in how the sort of impact, the broader impact of his work?
Oh, that's definitely true on both on a general level and a particular level. On a general level, well, I mean, I remember the sort of PR man from MI6 telling me that we regard George Smiley as an extension of British soft power, just like James Bond. I mean, it makes us appear more effective than we actually are. But in a sort of particular level, one of the characteristics of Le Carré's books, particularly his books about what he called the circus, which is a sort of a kind of synonym for MI6, is the use of jargon, intelligence jargon, and that makes it appear authentic. But actually, most of this jargon he coined himself. Jargon like lamplighters, pavement artists, the cousins, to refer to the Americans, or rather the CIA, etc., etc. Even the use of the term mole was not in general usage until Le Carré popularized it. But the funny thing is that now these terms are widely used within, not just in Britain, but also in the United States. These terms that he invented have become part of the jargon that are generally used by spies. So it's a case of life imitating art, if you like.
Well, and I think this is a good place perhaps to invite Ariel to sort of perhaps join in because of her interest in drama and the dramaturgy of this world. So maybe I'll turn over to Ariel because I think she has some thoughts and questions about Le Carré and his relationship to that side. Ariel, are you happy to?
Yeah, yes. I think in particular, both kind of the cyclical nature of life imitating art and art imitating life, with particularly with David's own personal history with theater and theatricality. I noticed in your biography, you mentioned that he was drawn to writing The Little Drummer Girl because he had noticed the parallels between acting and spying, which is a comparison that he also makes in Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy with when Smiley is waiting for the mole to arrive. Could you tell us more a little bit about David's own theatrical experiences, both in school and growing up, and his connection with his half-sister Charlotte?
Yes. I mean, he enjoyed acting both as a schoolboy and as an undergraduate, and as a trainee teacher, in a fairly amateur way, but nevertheless. But his sister Charlotte Cornwall, sadly, who has also died recently, joined the Royal Shakespeare Company and became a very well-known actress, and it was watching Charlotte on a touring RSC performance of, I think it was All's Well That Ends Well, but don't hold me to that. It might have been As You Like. Anyway, one of those Shakespeare plays, that he suddenly got the idea that an actress, in this case, might be used by an intelligence organization to infiltrate the other side. And indeed, what happens is that the little drummer girl is recruited by Mossad, the Israeli intelligence services, to infiltrate the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Although it's always ambiguous because she's quite sympathetic towards the Palestinians, in fact, probably more pro-Palestinian than pro-Israeli, so you never quite know which way she's going to jump. So that is the novel that most obviously plays to this theme, but it really does. He called it the theatre of the real. That was the expression that he used in that book. More generally in his writing, I mean, one of the strengths of his books is dialogue. He's very, very good on dialogue, and that's because he acted it out. And his process for writing was often he'd go for walks on Hampstead Heath or in Cornwall along the coastal footpath where he lived, and he would carry a notebook and he would be muttering. He'd be saying the lines that he imagined people would speak. often using an accent. A German accent or a Czech accent, a Polish accent, a Russian accent, an American accent, and he would wait till he got the line exactly as he wanted it, and then he'd scribble it down. And in fact, I was told that locals who lived nearby him in Cornwall knew that they shouldn't try and interrupt him when they saw him walking towards them on the coastal footpath, because he would be in rehearsal, as it were, for these lines. Then he'd scribble them down and take them back, and his poor wife had to type them out, and then he'd sort of fiddle with them a bit more. But that was the process.
And do you think that this relationship, this rehearsal process, had any kind of impact when the adaptations, the film adaptations, radio play adaptations came along later on, when he became a little bit more involved with those?
To some extent, yes. I mean, I think what it means is that the dialogue in the novels is very is right there for a script. You know, there are many very memorable lines, and the language works very hard. The dialogue works very hard, so that's good. And I think the other thing I should have said really about him is that he was a brilliant mimic, and very good at sort of taking off kind of people he knew, including Alec Guinness, who played his most famous character, Joel Smiley. But I mean, he could do an imitation of almost anyone, and have people laughing at it. Mrs. Thatcher, for example, did very. But even when he was working for MI6 in Bonn, he could do an imitation of the British ambassador's rather poor German, and have people in hoots of laughter at the rather amateurish German that the British ambassador came up with when speaking to German diplomats. So that helped, because you know he had a very finely trained ear for the nuances of language, like an actor. And as I said, the writing process itself had a kind of performance element to it. In terms of the adaptations, I mean, he used to say that a novel bears about as much relation to a film that's made out of it as a stock cube does to a cow, and that you shouldn't compare the two too much. But I mean, some of the adaptations of his novels have been great. Some of them have been not so great. Some of them have been pretty terrible. But I think that's the universal experience that happens to writers whose books are adapted for film. And you can't really control the process. One of the strange things that has happened with him is that in recent years he's developed a kind of thing of playing a cameo role in all the adaptations of his work, both for television and for feature films. So, for example, in The Night Manager, there's a scene in a restaurant where he is amongst a group of people dining at a nearby table to the table with Hugh Laurie and Tom Hiddleston and Tom Hollander and others, and he complains about something. I can't quite remember what he complains about, but anyway, he does have a speaking part, and that's been true now in 4 or 5 of the films. In fact, at the memorial service for David, the director of The Night Manager, Suzanne Beer, gave a wonderful address talking about that scene and talking about how she orchestrated that, and how professional he was. She was actually very impressed by how professional he was. He was as professional as the professional actors in that scene.
But this leads me to, I think, an interesting way that we can now talk about your interactions with him. And of course, Ariel, we can always circle back to the drama as we go forward, because this idea about playing a role, about being playful, I think was something that you had to negotiate, wasn't it, in terms of your own dealings with him? So it'd be lovely to hear maybe a bit more now on, how you come into his story and how you in turn, what you had to do or endure, or how you approached this as a biographer.
Yes, yes. Well, it was a curious business. I mean, writing a biography of a living person is quite different from writing a biography of someone who's safely dead. And in the case of le Carré, I met him at the start, and we drew up an agreement that the book would be written at arm's length, and that I would have editorial independence, and that he would grant me unlimited access, unlimited within certain practical considerations. And at the end of the process, he told me that he'd spent far more time talking about his life to me than he had to anybody else. I used to regularly go and see him and spend all day. Well, I'd arrive in mid-morning and usually leave at about 5 or 6 in the afternoon, often having had more drink than I should have had. I'd sort of tumble off into the night feeling happy and perhaps less coherent than I should have been. But in the process of interviewing him, I did sometimes wonder who was interviewing who. And he would say things to me like, well, if I was my biographer interviewing me now, the question I'd ask me would be this, which put me in my place. And then sometimes he would just let it drop. When we first met, he'd say something like, "Oh, I gather you've got a new girlfriend," or something like that. I think, what does he know about my life? But that's one of the techniques he would use, not just with me, I found with other people, to set them slightly, whatever the opposite of putting someone at their ease is, to put you on edge. He'd suggest that he knew more about your life than you thought he did. I also got the impression that to some extent I was spying on him. I spent quite a lot of time in his various houses, going through his records, going through his correspondence, sometimes finding some quite startling things, like a series of letters from a woman with whom he'd been having an affair, or a long piece he'd written. I think he'd forgotten that this was in his boxes in his archives in the 1960s for a psychoanalyst, really all about his sex life. Actually, I came to the conclusion that was as deceitful as anything else. There was quite a lot in there that just wasn't true. Certainly self-serving. One of the things about him is that all his books are to some extent autobiographical. I mean, he wrote one explicitly autobiographical novel, A Perfect Spy, which has a character just like him and a relationship with a father just like his, and so much so that the tease of that book is, was he really a double agent? Was he really working for the East back in the day? All his books, in fact, are autobiographical. Even from the very first. The very first book he wrote was called Call for the Dead, and it's about George Smiley, his sort of principal character, has been doing what was called positive vetting. That is, interviewing somebody who is going to a sensitive position in the civil service or in a defense establishment or scientific establishment, to check whether or not they might be a security risk. And he's done this with a senior civil servant who then commits suicide. And George Smiley's job is to investigate why this man committed suicide and whether there was something sinister about it. Well, that's exactly what David Cornwall was doing in the late 1950s. He became a bit of a specialist at positive vetting. He was felt to have very good skills. I should have mentioned in my brief synopsis of his career, by the way, that during his national service, that takes us back. I don't suppose the younger people have any idea what national service is, but national service was a thing that It was abolished before my time, thank goodness. But every young man, I don't know if it applied to women. I don't think it did, but of a certain age was supposed to spend a period of 2 years in some kind of military service. They still do in certain countries like Switzerland. And he was posted to the intelligence corps in Austria, which was then divided up between the Russians, the British, the French, and the Americans, and was full of spying. And his particular job was interrogating people who were fleeing from the East, many of whom were just refugees, but might have useful information, but some of whom were suspected as being agents provocateurs, perhaps, or were people who were deliberately coming to penetrate the West. So he had that early experience of interrogation, and many of the most dramatic scenes in his novels are of interrogations of one kind or another. I'm sorry, I've gone off the subject. So I was notionally interrogating him, but often I felt as if I was the subject of the interrogation. And there was, I mean, this leads to a sort of wider sort of topic, which perhaps those who haven't thought about biography before hasn't occurred to them. It hadn't occurred to me, which is that biography is always a bit of a struggle between the biographer and the subject. The subject, particularly someone still alive like Le Carré, has a lot of power. They can control the access to themselves and their archives, and they also got financial resources and indeed legal resources. But the biographer may have the last laugh, the last say. And so there's this struggle going on, about what's the truth and what's going to appear in the biography, and how are you going to be remembered. I noticed this first when I was writing about James Boswell's life of Dr. Johnson, but I experienced it in practice with John le Carré, with David Cornwall.
What in particular do you feel that he was being evasive about? What were did you get a sense that was he just generally evasive, or were there specific points at which he seemed to, dial up the deflection strategies? Or
yes, he was. Well, he was. I mean, he was very evasive about his intelligence activities. He said, "I undertook. I signed the Official Secrets Act. I undertook to keep a secret then, and I intend to keep it to the grave." And I'd say to him, "But David, you were posed against an enemy that doesn't exist anymore, the Soviet Union, and against East Germany, and you can surely tell us in general terms." But he wouldn't open up at all about that. And what I found out about his activities was all from other sources. I think partly he was embarrassed about it because one of the things he was doing was, again, spying on his friends. I found out, for example, that a close friend of his, a German friend of his, who became godfather to his eldest son, he was spying on him. He was thought to be a future, well, he became a prominent left-wing politician in Germany, and David was keeping an eye on him and keeping an eye on his contacts with the East. So his job really, as I understand it, and it was to keep an eye on extreme political movements in Germany. There was quite an anxiety in Britain and in the West generally about what would happen in Germany. There was the possibility of a Nazi revival, and indeed one of his novels deals with a neo-Nazi revival, but also the possibility of infiltration from the East, from East Germany, and of West German politicians being subverted or blackmailed by Eastern spies. So that was he was particularly evasive about that. He was also evasive to some extent about his personal life. I mean, he explained to me at the start that he'd had a messy personal life, and my goodness, it was messy. He was a serial adulterer. I have identified so far 10 extramarital affairs during his second marriage, but I'm sure there are more. I was I'm not a prude, but I was quite startled. Of course, this plays into a theme that that's very much there in his novels, of betrayal and deceit, which is and personal betrayal and deceit, and betrayal in this case of his wife, his second wife, with whom he had betrayed his first wife. It's a messy business, and one that caused quite a lot of pain, I think. And I do intend, in the fullness of time, to produce a revised edition of my book, now that both David and his widow are dead, which is more revealing about that aspect, because I could only really refer to it in general terms in the book.
With what would be the advantage of revisiting that text? Why spend that labor? What does that need to be told?
I think the advantage is because it's such a pervasive theme in his fiction, and because, in a way, he lived, when he stopped actively working for MI6, adultery became a form of spying for him. He had code books, he had dead letterboxes, he had cutouts, he used sub-agents. I mean, all these things. Some friends of his in Hampstead told me how they had, in the end, refused to act as cutouts for an affair he was having with an American photographer, for example. They felt embarrassed because they felt they didn't want to participate in betraying Mrs. Cornwall, Jane Cornwall. She was partially aware of what was going on, not wholly. But I mean, even when he was writing what is possibly his masterpiece, A Perfect Spy, most of the time he was writing that, he was in Greece with his latest mistress, and on the very island in which his character is during a particularly important episode in the book.
I do that's interesting, because I think that it's one of the things that perhaps is still missing a little bit from the literatures on secrecy and maybe even intelligence. I don't know. There are some experts in the room who are much more informed about the state of that literature, about the role of sexuality and the role of sex in the world.
I think, I mean, I agree. There's a danger of muckraking. I mean, I do feel sensitive about that. But I mean, let's consider Dickens, for example. I mean, when the first biographies of Dickens, like Forster's biography, presented him as having a blameless personal life. But now we know that he had Ellen Ternan, it was much more complicated than that. We don't necessarily think the less of Dickens's work. We just think that Dickens was a more complicated and tortured character. It adds, in fact, I think, to our understanding of Dickens, as in the great biography by Claire Tomlin, who also wrote about the invisible woman, as she called her. And indeed, these women may have played their own part in inspiring. I mean, for example, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold was written in a great burst of creativity, and it's definitely a big leap forward from his first two books, which have promise, but they're nothing like as good as The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, which is still a brilliant book and very well worth reading, by the way, those of you who haven't read it. And what was it that made him make that leap forward? Well, one theory, and this is what I believe, is he fell in love. He fell in love with a woman, not his wife, another married to one of his colleagues in the British Embassy in Bonn. And they had a very sort of tormented, in fact, one of the characters in the novel that he subsequently wrote, A Small Town in Germany, says it was a very grown-up affair. We did everything except go to bed together. But they did spend a lot of time in cars, in lay-bys, agonizing about whether to leave their spouses and so on. I think that's the intensity of feeling and the guilt and all the other emotions that were released by that definitely fed into the pain of the spy who came from the cold and made it a better book. I'm not saying you have to have an affair to write a book, but I do think that sometimes pain can be productive. You may remember Graham Greene saying, "An unhappy childhood is necessary for a novelist," and that's true of le Carré too.
I don't know. The trope of the suffering artist is one that I think we need to be a little bit cautious about.
Well, I agree with you. Yeah, you're right. You're right. Yeah.
So I think we need to save space for a few questions. And I also want to make sure, Ariel, if you had any like a last question, that you're happy to come in. But I did also want you to. It would be lovely if you could speak to this idea about the romantic biographer that you've spoken to me about before, and about this idea of inhabiting. Because I think for some of us who are interested in research methods and what it means to understand and interpret worlds, it would be interesting to hear what your thoughts are on that process and what it means.
Well, biography is such a sort of, I never really thought about biography until I wrote one. But I came to realize that biography is all sorts of things in one. I mean, there are all sorts of metaphors you can use. You can use the metaphor of the detective, for example. And there's certainly elements of that. You can use the metaphor of the spy. To some extent, I was spying on le Carré. I have a friend who is a biographer who wrote a biography of a living subject, and when he was out of the room, she rootled through his desk looking at his, letters and things. I think you can use the metaphor of the biographer as a sort of ghost, or possibly ghost hunter. I have twice slept in the beds of my dead subjects. I haven't tried on their clothes, but you might do that. And Richard Holmes, the great biographer Richard Holmes, has this idea of footsteps. I think that's what you're alluding to with the romantic biography, that there's a kind of pursuit, that biographers are kind of always chasing after, they're like Native American stalkers. They're always close behind their subjects, or trying to get close behind, and sometimes they might, they're following their tracks, as it were, and sometimes you might get close enough to get a glimpse of your quarry in the distance, or hear their footsteps up ahead, but you never catch them up. You can never completely. That's an impossible aim, but nevertheless, the pursuit is worth it for itself. So there are all these different kinds of role that you play as a biographer, to a greater or lesser extent, partly depending on the subject and partly depending on the circumstance. And I enjoy it all.
Yeah, and I think that mirrors often our experiences of some of our research methods, which revolve around interviews or trying to get into the thought processes of others in order to better make an account of something that's happened. And then sorry, Ariel, I don't want to leave you out. Did you have anything you want to? I wanted to push the ignorance question on you then. Because of course it's been, we're interested in secrecy, but we're also interested in ignorance and how that features. So I think my final question before we open up to other questions is there, how do you think ignorance features in this process of biography writing, of investigation of the life of le Carré?
One can never know the whole truth. Sometimes you can know more than your subject does, strangely, and certainly you can know more than anybody else does. I mean, this is something I found very alarming when I wrote my first biography, was how quickly you get to know things that even husbands and wives or children or parents don't know, close colleagues, as a complete stranger. It's like a sort of alarmingly privileged position, but worryingly so. On the question of the ignorance of your subject, I recall an occasion when I went to lunch with David, and he started to tell me a story about how he came to teach at Eton, and I interrupted him rather brusquely and said, "No, David, it wasn't like that at all. I've just been reading the file." and he was startled, and I'm quite sure that he genuinely believed what he was trying to tell me, and was quite shocked to find that it was a false memory. So in some ways, you know more than your subject, but of course there will always be hidden corners. Well, yeah, another thing. I don't even know whether I should say this really, but I do know a deeply intimate personal thing about one of the women that le Carré was involved with that he never knew. I won't say any more than
that. Probably best. Excellent. Okay, so I think we have a couple of minutes left for questions. I see that there already are some comments. Thank you very much. There is a specific question. If you have other questions, if you're happy to raise your hand or drop them into the text, into the chat, do so. Please feel free to do so now. One of the specific questions we have from someone was, did you get to have access to the suppressed, not published biographical manuscript from someone in the audience? Does that ring any bells for you?
Not really, no. I'm not sure what that refers to. I mean, he did, after my book came out, he produced a so-called memoir, which was, in fact, a series of pieces, many of which had been published before. So I'd read those, and I'm afraid it didn't really tell me anything I didn't know, and it told me some things I knew weren't true. So that was one of the trouble with le Carré. There's a great deal of myth making all the time about, and indeed I didn't really stress this enough, that he, throughout his career, he enjoyed playing a game with his many readers. I mean, for many years, he denied that he'd been in the intelligence services. It was only kind of in the mid-70s that he finally admitted that, after he'd been a bestseller for more than 10 years. Sorry. Carry on.
Sorry, there's been a clarification to clarify. I mean, the manuscript prior to Sisman's that was offered to publishers, but which le Carré had suppressed by lawyers.
Yes, I did. Yes, there was a... Oh, it's interesting you know about that. I'm intrigued. And yes, in fact, this is described in my book. Somebody tried to write a biography of him quite a long time ago, and he managed to get that suppressed. I've seen the outline for that. It was never written. It was just an outline. But it was a very careless thing to do, actually. It was written, it was a journalist on the Daily Express, I think, who wrote a sort of tells-all type outline and sold it for quite a lot of money to a publisher, without it occurring to him that le Carré or the other people involved, particularly the women, might be upset. And in no time whatsoever, he had a legal writ on him, and he had to cancel his contract. I think that's probably what you're referring to.
Very good. We also have a question from Brian Rappert. Brian, are you happy to go ahead?
Sure, great. Thanks. It's been a fascinating hour, but I just maybe want to just focus on something that's come up on stuff. But I just want to, and that's the rule of truth in biography. And yeah, I mean, in this sort of area where issues of authenticity and hidden truths are floating around, right? And even producing people's senses of what they did in the past, and where they are. And I guess I just wonder, where as a biographer do you say, okay, the truth here is maybe not the most important thing, or here's where, like, I just have to set that aside because maybe I want to do something else, like I want to exemplify, I don't know, something about the character of David or whatever. Is there some part, because I hear the truth is very important for you, but is there some part too when you're writing biographies on a topic like this where you just decide I have to be concerned about something else?
It's a very good point, and it's actually how I begin my book, and it's a theme that runs right through it. I begin my book by telling a story, which is the story that David told about how his parents met, and I describe this over some 2 or 3 pages, and then I say, that's the story. Is it true? And then I give some reasons for thinking that it's not true. And this is a theme, in a way, right through my book. There's a commentary on the story that David has told about his life and kind of cross-examining that. He complained about this a lot when he read the manuscript. He said, why is it you don't believe me? And I said, because you yourself have said that you're a liar. You know, he wasn't terribly happy about that, but he was hoist with his own petard. But it is about the quest for truth. Of course, we can never know what is the truth about a human being. We can never know what that is, and their inner motivation. We can't even really be sure of our own motivations, but we can try as much as possible to get at the truth and to interrogate the truth. And that's what I try to do in my book, and generally try and do with biography, because I think it's what makes biography worth reading is to understand as much as we can what happens in the lives of other people. I mean, that's the thing that I've devoted my working life to doing, and it's something that I find deeply enriching personally, and so I'm totally committed to it.
Which is a good segue into the next question, which might sadly be our last one, at least for this time, is a question as to whether or not there's another author or another figure that you would be interested in writing about. So you briefly mentioned Fleming and Green. If you had the chance, who else would you be interested in writing about?
Well, if I was, I probably would be. Actually, a publisher did approach me about writing a new life of Graham Greene soon after my book came out, and there was a need for a one-volume general life. But in fact, I happened to know already that somebody was writing it, and I'd been in touch with a Canadian academic who I'd been in touch with, and because there was some correspondence between Greene and le Carré, very interesting, in fact, and le Carré's, Greene's influence on le Carré. So I'm always looking for subjects, and I'm always very happy to have suggestions. Obviously, I, as a professional author, need a subject that's going to sell, and that I can, you know, persuade a publisher to pay me an advance to write. But within that, those constraints, I'm quite wide-ranging.
Excellent. So I thank you so much, Adam. I think we're going to have to end our session today, although I feel like we've just hit a wonderful, rich seam of areas to explore. But it's been absolutely wonderful to hear you spend a bit more time talking about the project and the life of John le Carré. Thank you so much to Ariel for joining us today. There's so much more to explore there as well. And thank you to everyone in the audience who took the time and to share your lunch hour with us. We will have the recording up on the Southwest Doctoral Training Program website soon. So if you'd like to revisit some of the conversation, do consider stopping by their website. And of course, we will have these other events. So you can also check into that website to see what's coming up. So once again, thank you. Join me in thanking Adam for his time and for all of his expertise. And thank you for being with us. Thanks, Adam.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.